So I'm really excited to announce, I guess this is a kind of de facto launch of the Psychedelic Industry UK. So who are we? Well, we are the first trade organisation in the UK representing the psychedelic industry. It comprises of a group of very stellar co-founders that I've worked with over the last 6 to 7 years during my time as a psychedelic researcher and scientist. So I'm a co-founder and the chief scientific officer of this organisation, and I'm joined by James Bunn, who's the CEO and has worked with me for about 7 years at Drug Science as chief operating officer there, but as CEO in this organisation. Mike Morgan-Giles, who founded a very similar organisation in the cannabis sector called the Cannabis Industry Council, and Lucas Mahue, who is involved in fundraising and business development. So what is it that we want to do? And I think it kind of really follows on neatly from what Martin was saying. We see the UK as being a hub for innovation, for science, for the development of biotech. But in order for us to deliver research into reality, what we really need is to have cohesive industry standards and cohesive amount of engagement to be able to deliver the research into healthcare systems. So our mission is to unify the industry and to promote sustainable growth and ensure that we have ethical practices. And what we're modelling ourselves off primarily are other organisations globally, such as in Canada, PsyCan, and in America, the Psychedelic Medicines Association. So we're here today, and this is a very bad omission that I haven't included Exeter University as being a leading psychedelic university, which they very rightfully are. But before Exeter University, Imperial really did lead the charge in the world and the UK. I might be slightly biased, but it is partly true, along with colleagues from Johns Hopkins and the US too. But really the pioneering work of my boss, Professor David Nutt, and Robin Carhart-Harris really spearheaded what I see as, when I first started, science, a bit of a fringe science, into actually something that people were starting to take notice of. So today in the UK, it's not just scientists that represent the industry. It's the complexity of people working across venture capital, legal and regulatory sectors, healthcare, well-being, retreats, manufacturing, production, distribution, drug development, clinics and labs, and that's just to name a few. And the cohesion of all of these entities is necessary to actually develop and deliver the promise of psychedelic medicine. Science alone is not sufficient in order for us to get there. So how did we get there? So you may have heard a lot of the history of psychedelics, and I'm not going to bore you with the details of what happened kind of globally, but maybe you might be more interested in what happened actually here in the UK. So it was actually started off by this gentleman, Dr. Ronald Sanderson. Some of you may know him, others may not, but he returned from Switzerland in 1952 with 100 vials of LSD. And he was working at a specific hospital in southwest England. And he gave a very small number of patients, only 14 of them, psycholytic therapy. So that's not mini dosing or microdosing. It's not macrodosing. It's somewhere sort of in between 5 to 10 different sessions and different therapies. And he found that the results were pretty good for people that were treatment refractory to depression and even schizophrenia as well. And he found that around 3 treatments, 1 of the participants greatly improved, 6 were moderately improved in an average of 2 treatments, and 2 were not improved at all. So these were very pioneering treatments. And you can see here a newspaper cutting from 1968 in the Worcester Evening News, which is one of actually the first magazine clippings of psychedelic therapy and its use in the UK in hospitals. So he worked in Powick Hospital, and they developed really the first psychedelic NHS-based clinic in the UK, quite akin to what's happening at Cyprus Clinic, which David Arizzo and Martin mentioned before. But in the UK alone during that period, 4,000 patients were treated with psychedelic therapy, over 50,000 psychedelic drug-assisted sessions. So psychedelic-assisted therapy in medicine is not new to the UK, and actually within some sort of living memory has been accessible. Now, we've all seen this graph before. Psychedelic research stopped, and it came back, but it's coming back at an accelerated pace. There's actually 600% greater increase in research output in 2010 versus 2020, and that's just accelerating over time. Arguably, we now know more about psychedelics than we ever have in the history of civilization. It started off with some pioneering work, actually, that was done by people like Matt Wall in the crowd and others. And it was funded by organizations like Beckley Foundation. And you've seen this graph, which has become a little bit of a meme for psychedelic brain imaging. But what this really fundamentally showed is that there is a brain mechanism to psychedelics. And for non-neuroscientists out there, you might think, why is this important? Well, for us, it's exciting, but actually for the general public, for regulators, for people in the general public, this shows that psychedelics not only have a biological action in brain targets associated with psychiatric conditions, but that they actually do have this medical property that can be actually seen, because sometimes you really have to see it to believe it and to get under the lid of what the so-called magic really is. So some of this research catalyzed, these findings. In 20 patients, that 70% went into remission within the first week. And actually, after about 3 months, most participants still remained in remission from treatment-resistant depression. We have to remember that these treatments are for the treatment refractory. They're not for the patients that are responding initially in this study. And this was really a blockbuster in psychiatry. So this caused a lot of excitement, as many of you know. And as Henry pointed out to earlier, the growth of biotech happened with Compass leading the charge. And many other organizations here, particularly in the UK, so small pharma turning into Cybin, Atai Life Sciences setting up a base here, Beckley SciTech, GH Research in Ireland, and so on, with many UK-based founders really kind of spearheading along this. And alongside this, the growth of amazing CROs like Clark and Well that we mentioned, different legal sectors like mackerel solicitors and so on. Now, you've all seen this graph as well. This is kind of the pivotal phase 2b study, which shows clearly in that dose-dependent manner that Henry described before, that there's a separation, not just between 1 and 25, but between 10 and 25 milligrams, which really shows the clear impact that the 25 milligram larger dose has. So this is a very good example of how we can do good drug development. But it's not just psychedelics. We know now that MDMA, ketamine, DMT, derivatives of DMT, cannabis, psilocybin, LSD, you name it, they are being treated in and trialed for in a range of different psychiatric and neurological conditions. So part 2, what happened in the later parts of the 2010? So studies were now getting approved by the FDA, by the EMA with the so-called breakthrough therapy designation, but here in the UK, we have our own regulator, the MHRA. Now, many drug developers engage with the MHRA, and they developed this specialist scheme, which is called the ILAP designation, and there's still a little bit of debate over the utility of this scheme for drug developers. It's not really sure whether or not this might be useful. But what's important, I think, is to start having the discussion right now about how we can optimize these systems in order to actually allow drug developers to get to their end goal of market success. We also don't really know now whether the mutual recognition system between the FDA, which now allows, it's probably one of the only silver linings from Brexit, and allows the UK to make decisions on medicine regulations independent of Europe. And so as of 1st of January 2025, there was this mutual recognition scheme. We don't know with the current administration whether that will still prevail, but these kinds of solutions about dynamically engaging with regulatory agencies around the world might be another thing that the UK really needs to start thinking about and getting behind. So there's a lot of research that still needs to be done. So this was kind of in the last 2 years, a summary of what really we need to get through as scientists, and it was written by David Nutt, David Rizzo, and Meg Spritz. We still don't know to this day whether in psychedelic science, whether the long trip, 6 hours or 12 hours for LSD or half an hour for DMT is necessary. What's the optimal trip duration? This has direct commercial implications, and the obvious one is cost benefit. We don't know right now whether these kind of concomitant medications can elongate the antidepressant effect, whether they reduce it. we actually still don't know, despite what many of you may have been told, whether therapy is necessary. There's not been one good trial yet to support either or, and so we have to remain open to the possibilities of trialing it before we actually determine the role of therapy in these treatments. I'm for therapy, just as a disclaimer, but we do need science in order to back these conclusions. We still don't know to this day the brain mechanisms, and through brain mechanisms we can develop novel targets and treatments. We have so-called first-generation psychedelics, and biotechs are now putting a lot of funding into second and so-called third-generation psychedelics, fascinating amounts of research, which may or may not have benefit, but the more we understand about the brain and the mind, the better we are at actually developing these targeted treatments. I'm not going to go into this in much more detail, but if you really want to know what the next phase of research for the rest of this decade should be, I really highly recommend this paper from David. So I went on clinicaltrials.gov the other day to really try and understand where we're up to with clinical development right now. And it was actually, surprisingly encouraging to see that there's 230 interventional studies registered now. And they're all at something called phase 2 clinical trials. So this is testing safety and efficacy. It's no longer really just first in human. And you can see over here that there's actually 10 trials now in phase 3. So we're really moving along the process of drug development. It's no longer fringe science. It's no longer really early stage clinical development. This is mid to late stage clinical development. And that's why now is the real appropriate time to be starting to think about things like market access and integration into existing healthcare systems. Now, without doubt, psychiatry is probably one of the hardest areas to actually innovate in for many of the reasons that Martin discussed before. So this is a graph taken from an article in The Economist last year, which looks at the average length of time to take a drug to market in psychiatry, and that's 7.4 years on this graph. You can see over time, though, the R&D costs per drug is increasing from about 1 billion in 2014 to 2 billion over the space of 6 years. So not only, and also the timings are increasing, so not only is drug development arguably getting a little bit worse in terms of timing, it's getting more costly. So when we compare psychiatric drug development, on average, it's about $1 billion per drug, and it takes about 15 years. So this is the most recent update. You compare it to oncology. Oncology is about $300 million, and it takes 5 years. And that's why right now in drug development, you have a plethora of oncologists, that's cancer-related drugs and anti-neoplastic drugs, whereas in psychiatry, we have less because they have the same frame and window of time to get that money back in the data exclusivity period. And so it's important that we actually start thinking, how can we start innovating in psychiatry to make it easier and more attractive to drug developers? You can see over here that things like hematology drugs, metabolic drugs, they have a higher rate of success of going through to late stage clinical trials, and psychiatry and neurology are that. Actually, this is kind of in contrast to what I just said before, but I think this graph needs updating. But yeah, oncology drugs are by far the most lucrative drugs. So another excellent paper coming out only a few weeks ago that I highly recommend anyone interested in drug development and industry to look at is written by Professor David Nutt, of course, who has spent 50 years and is probably the best place to actually give his personal opinion, which this paper was. And he describes different examples over here of how public recognition, regulatory reform, innovating for reward, industry processes, and patient focus can all be optimized specifically in psychedelic therapy, so not psychiatry at large. He does go into that in this paper. But the kind of main conclusion really is that, or the question that he asks is it critical that we rise to this challenge and resuscitate psychiatric drug development with psychedelic therapy? Well, we know that mental health is pertinent. 1 in 4 people have a diagnosable mental health problem in the UK at the moment. It costs about £118 billion annually, including healthcare, lost productivity costs, and social support. About 50% of patients currently respond to treatments and fewer achieve full remission. Only 30 to 30% of patients with addiction respond to current interventions. We know that there's over 1 million people currently suffering with treatment-resistant depression. That's people that do not respond to current treatment or innovations in this country. And we've seen a doubling of that rate since COVID, and that rate is only going up. And we still, unfortunately, have this suicide problem in the UK, which is a leading cause of death in young people and the leading cause of death in men under the age of 50. So we do need urgent and innovative treatments for an increasingly more mentally unwell population. So I'd argue maybe over the last 7 years or so, whilst I've kind of seen the sector evolve, is that it's not just scientists that are now interested in this space. We have psychiatrists and psychologists such as the BACP doing these articles about the importance of psychedelic therapy. You have the UK Parliamentary Office on Science and Technology this year publishing 6 reports covering different indications, as well as policy and reform, encouraging politicians and regulatory stakeholders to engage in order to allow for red tape to reduce so that we can facilitate the integration of research into healthcare. And then finally, you have the big dogs coming in with a lot of money, and quite rightfully, many people are scared of Big Pharma because of what they've done with the opiate pandemic and how they have potentially commercial incentives. But what I'd argue is that the coming together of all of these different factions of people, scientists, psychiatrists, psychologists, policymakers, and Big Pharma is essential and necessary to get these things over the line. Because ultimately, without the cohesion across all of these different industries, not working in silo, but collectively is the only way that in the UK at least, we will be able to realise the dream of getting psychedelics in the NHS for patients to access. The UK public support it. 62% of individuals in the UK at the latest YouGov poll said they support the medical use. In the UK alone, there's over 30 plus clinical trials happening. The UK psychedelic biotech sector has grown by 300% over the last 10 years, and the UK accounts for about 7% of the global psychedelic startup market, making it the leader in the EU for psychedelic biotech startups. The investment focus will continue despite a bit of a short term. Josh Hardman and Psychedelic Alpha did some surveys which shows that investors are still committing predominantly towards biotechnology at the moment, but with an increased look to manufacturing in the future. We do actually have NHS buy-in, as well as Martin mentioned before, that these pilots going on, such as with ketamine, and I'm working very closely with the National Gambling Clinic for a trial that I'm working on. And so there is engagement at the level of the NHS. And amazingly, work like Celia Morgan's in Awaken Life Sciences really kind of spearheaded what I think in the UK is the first example of a public, private and university partnership in order to allow for access for ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for alcohol use disorder. So going back to Psychedelic Industry UK, what we want to develop is an infrastructure that brings about the combination of all of these factors of people working across organisations. Working in silos doesn't work. We've seen the cannabis sector fail quite miserably in the UK, I'd say, due to people individually and companies individually trying to achieve their aims. We need to be working together. And I know that's difficult because a lot of individuals want to be the first to the market or the first to be able to do this. We need to stop thinking about personal first. It's not a very psychedelic way of thinking. What we will offer as part of the group is different marketing events. We'll create working groups across different sectors. And just want to show you now, we do have a diverse range of different organizations that are currently involved. So these are the current members that we have. And I can say that we've been speaking to Big Pharma as well. We've had meetings with Compass Pathways, GH Research, Cybin, who are all interested. But the crux of the matter is here. It's a bit of a catch 2022. We can't do anything until we have buy-in. And the biotechs will say, we want to see you do something. So in order to get us round the table, we really need to have an open discussion about what it is that we really want to do, what it is that we're willing to share. So we're still working on that, and we're still trying to get buyer engagement. But what we're really pleased to announce today is that we've managed to get this international partnership. So we've recently partnered with the Psychedelic Medicines Coalition in the US, PsyCan, and we're looking to partner with groups in Australia, as well as Perea and other organizations in Europe too. And we believe this international collaboration is important, and we really want to lead with collaboration and not competition. But predominantly our focus is the UK, because we want to see, as I mentioned, psychedelics in the NHS. But what's more important than me continuing to talk is what's on your mind. So now I invite you to do a little bit of feedback. So if you grab your phone out and go on this QR code, we made a list of 10 different priority areas that we think might be of interest for people in the sector. And we encourage you and invite you to pick your top 3 that you'd like the Psychedelic Industry UK to focus on over 2025. And we'll be publishing a report soon based on the kind of the feedback. So yeah, if you can take a few minutes to do that, and then I'll be happy to answer questions at the same time whilst everyone's reading through. Thank you. Yeah, well, that's kind of precisely why we're here, which is kind of the psychedelic cultural hub, I guess, of the UK, because we really want feedback from people who are part of the community, not just the science and biotech conferences that we speak at. We really want engagement at the core of what matters in terms of reciprocity to individuals that have, nurtured this in the British Isles, for example. So it really is at the core, and I completely understand they are very disparate sort of entities. The psychedelic community has been here for a while, and as I showed you, it's only really since like the mid-2010s that corporate psychedelics have started to come into fashion. But it's almost something that we can't ignore, because it's accelerating at a pace, as I demonstrated, quite rapidly. And so we want to do this ethically, we want to do it sustainably. That's really part of our core mission. We want to engage with user groups, not just the biotech groups or the regulatory and finance folk. We want to engage with people like Breaking Convention and individuals that work for charities. I work with Drug Science, for example, for the last 7 years, which really represents a lot of grassroots and charity-based sort of thinking about drug education and harm reduction. So yeah, we are very much all sitting in 2 camps, I'll be honest. We sit in a camp where we have to think about the practicalities of getting this medicine into the NHS require buy-in from pharma and corporate, and we can't hide away from that. That's the way these systems work. But what we can do is do things differently. And what we want to do is actually platform an industry which allows for that recognition of the cultural backbone of psychedelics in the UK.
There seem to be 2 important tracks here. One is the biotech companies that are doing psychedelic drug development, and the other is building the ecosystem to actually deliver these medicines so that they can make a real difference in the lives of people. And I'm wondering to what extent Psychedelic Industry UK plans to be actively involved in pushing for expanded patient access, as has been done in Australia and Canada, so that the delivery ecosystem can begin to be prototyped here in the UK?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm just going to go back to the slide over here. You can see in small writing, national stakeholder engagement, and I've listed every agency I could possibly think of in the UK that would be necessary to allow for that patient access to be expanded. So we're starting the process. Actually, next week, I'm speaking to the ex-head of Public Health England with David Nutt and David Arizzo, and we're trying to understand from a public health perspective whether we can actually integrate psychedelics prior to phase 3 trials. That's something that David Nutt and colleagues spearheaded in Australia. And that would arguably be a great thing. We don't need to necessarily rely on pharma to finish phase 3 if there's a legal precedent. Now, in order for that to actually deliver, as I said, we need engagement across all of these sectors. So it's easier said, of course, than done. But of course, we want to be able to sit in a position. The worst thing about what's happening in this country at the moment is, despite the fact that we really kind of have been the innovators in terms of the science, we are by far the last country that will receive the access to these treatments because of the red tape and because of having to go through all of these checkpoints. So it's not an easy task, but it's definitely something that Psychedelic Industry UK are going to try and try to reach for.
Hi, I have a question about ketamine being available in the public in the public sector. I come from Spain and it's not. So there are some clinics that, there are some private clinics where you can get access to that, but not in the public sector. And I think there is already enough evidence, like there's a lot of good scientific evidence for that, including if you look at the bipolar guideline, like it's very well accepted by the medical community already. So what exactly is missing for the NHS and the public sector to accept?
With ketamine?
Yeah.
So in the UK, there's one kind of NHS private sector clinic in Oxford, which allows individuals to come in for a very biologically focused ketamine intervention therapy led by Rupert McShane and colleagues. So that's one example of one that works. You have to pay for it, but he's an NHS consultant, and he really pioneered that in the UK. Now, what Martin was speaking about earlier is actually trialing ketamine-assisted therapy in a more psychedelic sort of manner within CNWL, which is a trust in London. Unfortunately, I think, well, ketamine is cheap. Ketamine costs about £3 per bag. So it's used in hospitals. I know you were at Celia's talk yesterday. And it's used in hospitals every day in the UK. It's predominantly used in anesthesiology and pain relief, post-operative care. But in psychiatry, it's not being used because it's off-label. It doesn't have a nice recommendation to that. And esketamine, which is kind of the licensed non-psychedelic sort of ketamine derivative, that's not deemed to be cost-effective. So in short, I guess I'm not sure why ketamine is not being delivered more at scale. I guess it's more about those systems and infrastructure issues that need to be kind of addressed in order to get it into a place where clinicians and payers and insurers are able to. To be honest, it's not my area of expertise. I think maybe Martin might have some more insights on that. But I think by and large, there's good clinical evidence for using ketamine in depression. I think, it's been researched for about 30, 40 years now, and more so now with addiction. One of the things that might change it in the UK is the phase 3 CARE trial being done by Celia Morgan. Once that trial is out, they might get a marketing authorization, and that might then unlock the kind of pathways to allow it to be able to be prescribed at a more national scale. So hopefully that trial will unlock a bit more access, I think, in the UK at least.